Hey, everybody. First of all, thanks for your flexibility with this, different new sort of last minute switch in lecture style. It's important to start trying this stuff out now because ADA requirements kick in next month, and existing materials are going to have to be compliant and things like that. So there are probably going to be some little bumps on the way, and that's also part of why I'm doing this now, so that I can hear from you what kind of works and what doesn't, so we can think about how to, do classes like this going forward. So let's go through some of the things that I wanted to clarify, provide examples for on the lecture notes for this week. So first of all, let's talk about the difference between ideological polarization and affective polarization. And I also want to bring in another concept here from a previous week, which is identity strength. All of these things are related and can cause each other potentially, or at least contribute to each other. So, ideological polarization has been shown to increase affective polarization. Identity strength can also increase affective polarization. So, they're all related, but they are also not identical. And it's important to remember which is which and how to separate them. So when we think about ideological polarization, we're thinking purely about somebody's beliefs and ideally their belief system as a whole, right? To the extent that people have belief systems, which turns out lots of people kind of don't. But anyway, ideological polarization can't really exist in a vacuum. It's always in the comparison, right? When we think about polarization, right, we're talking about poles like the poles of a magnet, right? North pole, south pole, further apart. So that means there has to be something to be further apart from. So when we talk about ideological polarization, usually what we're talking about is a person being really far apart from either society at large or from the other side of the aisle, right? So, somebody who is, for example, like a hardcore communist would be very polarized ideologically from the American public and would also be polarized even if we look at just the Democratic Party or American left-wing politics in general, because even the left side of American politics don't tend to be communist, right? They tend to be much further to the right. It's always about that comparison. If, on the other hand, somebody were a communist in a heavily communist country or a country with a much more active and successful communist party, we wouldn't call them ideologically polarized because they would be much closer to the norms and values of sort of the average citizen, or at least a set of semi average citizens in that context. So, ideological polarization is about distance from something. And usually we're talking about distance from either the other side or from the middle is kind of how we tend to talk about ideological polarization. Now, that's different than identity strength, right? Identity strength is not how extreme are you, which is kind of what we're talking about when we talk about ideological polarization. Identity strength is basically how important is it to you to be what you are, right? And that can, of course, be partisanship. How important is it to you that you are a Democrat or a Republican? But of course, comes up with other things, right? Like how important is it to you to be a Marine or a soccer player or a student or a GSU alum or something like that, right? So somebody who is very moderate, somebody who's a sort of run-of-the-mill, very centrist Democrat or Republican could still be a strong Democrat or Republican, could still have high identity strength if being a Democrat or Republican is particularly important to them. Now, ideological extremity and identity strength tend to often go hand in hand. It is often the case that people who are, far to one side or the other also identify very strongly with their preferred party, but it doesn't have to be the case. And one thing that is sort of interesting, if you ever want to dive deeper into this, or if you go think about political science graduate programs, you might find out a little bit more about. It is, in American politics at least, often the case that, at least on the left, as you go further left in terms of ideological polarization and extremity, those people actually end up the further left you go, kind of hating the Democratic Party. So, whereas Republicans go further right and on average tend to like the Republican Party more, Democrats, as they go further left than the Democratic Party, tend to kind of hate the Democratic Party and see it as overly centrist or too conservative or things like that. So identity strength and ideological polarization often move together, are often related, but don't have to be, and can sometimes have sort of opposite effects depending on the exact combination of identity and partisanship and ideology. So ideological polarization is, in shorthand, how extreme are your beliefs? Identity strength is how important are your beliefs or identities to you. And then affective polarization is a little bit different. Affective polarization is, in one way to think of it, is how much do you hate the other side? Now, we still care when we're thinking about affective polarization about a difference, right? Polarization, poles on two opposite sides. But for affective polarization, what we care about or the difference we care about is sometimes more internal, right? So for ideological polarization, I can't by myself in a vacuum be ideologically polarized because I have to be compared to something, right? I'm more extreme than something. But I could individually, internally be affectively polarized because the difference we sometimes care about with affective polarization is the difference between how much I like my party and hate the other side or dislike the other side. And that could manifest in a few different ways, right? I could really, really like my party and be kind of indifferent about the other party. That would still be affective polarization because I'm, really high up on one and kind of middling on the other. It could also be the case that like my party's fine, it's whatever. I don't super love it, but God, do I hate the other side, right? That would also be affective polarization. Hating the other side is often what we're talking about. It's often what political scientists care about. And often when we're talking about it, especially in the news or in society, we're not talking about it individually. We're talking about how much the two sides hate each other, right? But all of that is to say, we can talk about affective polarization in a few different ways. It could be caused by me really liking my party or really hating the other party or both. We could talk about an individual being very affectively polarized because that internal gap that I have between liking my party and disliking the other is quite wide. Or we could talk about it on a social level where we say Americans are very affectively polarized because Democrats really hate Republicans and Republicans really hate Democrats, and so on. So make sure you understand the difference between ideological polarization and affective polarization, and don't get either one of them confused with identity strength. Difficult to do sometimes because, like I said, all of those things can be related and can play off of each other, but they are all nevertheless distinct concepts. As the sort of lecture I hope has shown, and as political science research has largely continued to bear out, the American public isn't really that ideologically polarized. People's specific opinions have changed about various issues, both at an individual level, at a social level, right? Americans change how they feel about certain issues, but we haven't really seen a lot of people moving to the extremes. We haven't seen a lot of people becoming really extreme conservatives or liberals either direction. The proportion of people saying they're moderate is about the same as it's been the last 40, 50 years. The amount of people saying they're extreme has been about the same. Some of the specifics have changed, right? Republicans today believe somewhat different things than Republicans did in the 1970s. Same thing with Democrats. But the relative concentration, the amount of people who are loading up on extreme ideological views hasn't really changed. Most people just really don't care that much about politics. Most people don't think that much about politics. And most people, to the extent they do, end up kind of sort of somewhere near the middle where they have considerations on both sides of an issue. They care a lot about one or two, and that's about it, right? Beyond that, they don't have much ideology most of the time, and they're perfectly happy to go along with whatever their party says. They don't necessarily internally believe it a whole lot. Okay, next thing that I flagged to talk about in the lecture notes are implicit measures. So we talked at the beginning of the semester about survey response issues, right? We're concerned that if we just ask people what they think about any given topic, they might not answer accurately for a variety of reasons. They might be concerned about social desirability. They might engage in expressive responding, right? And that in particular is a concern for measuring affective polarization. It's real easy. It's real popular. It might even, in some cases, be socially desirable for you to say how much you hate the other side, right? Certainly in certain social circles and internet spaces, it's often socially desirable, and there's social pressure to say that you really hate the other side, right? Or you may have seen people when they're about to say something that maybe kind of totally doesn't go along with their party line or their ideological line, they might qualify it first by talking about how good of a Democrat they are, or how good of a liberal they are, or how committed a Republican they are, so that they can build up their bona fides before they go and say something contradictory or potentially contradictory. So all of that is to say, we're concerned that people might be exaggerating the extent to which they hate the other side or refusing to tell us that they're actually maybe not that cool with their own side. And that's going to make affective polarization look bigger than it actually is. So one way to get around survey response issues, not just with affective polarization, but with anything, is to use measures that it's harder for people to lie on intentionally or not. And implicit measures and behavioral measures are two ways to do that. So, one of the most common ways we measure implicit attitudes is what's called the implicit association test. I think I've talked about this a little bit already, but I'll go back over it now. Remember spreading activation theory, right? Remember affective tags. So you have a network of objects in your memory. Each one of them has an affective tag, positive or negative. And each object in memory is associated with other objects in memory. And when objects are more closely associated, the connection comes to mind much faster, literally in a shorter amount of time. So we can exploit that to measure those associations, to try to map out people's networks internally. So what the implicit association test does is it's sort of a sorting task. You look at a screen, and in the middle of the screen, you're going to get a word or a picture, and your job is to sort that by pressing buttons to one side of the screen or the other. And at first, that's really easy, right? So we use the implicit association test to, for example, measure things like racial attitudes, right? People don't want to admit if they have racial prejudice. So one way we think we can measure that is through the implicit association test. So they would see white faces and then black faces, and they would have to sort, white faces to one side, black faces to the other. And then in round two, instead of faces, they see words. They see positive words and negative words, and they have to sort positive words to one side and negative words to the other. And then when we get to rounds 3 and 4, they have to do both. They're going to get in the middle of the screen either a word or an image. And in one round, they have to put white faces and negative words on one side and black faces and positive words on the other. And then they're switched, right? White and positive, black and negative. And what the theory is here is that if one of those things is harder for me, if it takes me longer, if I make more mistakes, if, for example, when white is paired with positive and I'm pushing both of those things to the same side of the screen, if that's easier for me than it is when black is paired with positive things, that is perhaps a measure of my internal network that I might hold some negative views, right? And we can do the same thing with partisanship. We can pair images or pictures or words associated with one party or the other with positive words or images and negative words and images. And if I have a harder time linking, for example, Republican with negative, and I'm really, really good at linking Democratic, words and images with negative ideas, then the idea there is that I have some implicit association. My connection in my brain between Democrats and negative ideas is much stronger than Republicans and negative ideas, so I hold some implicit biases. We'll show an example of this in class, but that's the idea of the implicit association test. And indeed, we find if we do those implicit association tests, people show evidence of partisan bias. People are pretty good at the sorting task when they have to put my party and positive words together. They get worse when they have to put my out party and positive words together, which is maybe some suggestive evidence that in their minds, those schemas, those networks are really heavily associating the out party with negativity or the in party with positivity. I also said I would go in and explain a little bit about dictator games and trust games. So, this technically isn't really political psychology. It's a related field called behavioral economics. What behavioral economics is trying to do is do in what we call incentivized experiments, where they put real money on the table, not usually a lot, a few dollars, maybe $10 to $30, depending on the experiment. And people are incentivized to make certain decisions. So a dictator game is a really, really simple version of this. In a dictator game, I sit down, you sit down as the participant, and I tell you, I'm going to give you $10. You can keep this, you can walk away, you can take the full $10, or I've got John over here and you can give him as much or as little as you want. And then what I do is I change different facts about John to see how that affects the average participant's decision to give or not give money and how much they give. right? And unsurprisingly, people are much more willing to share and share larger amounts if I tell you that John also happens to vote for the same party that you do. And when John doesn't, when John prefers the other candidate, the awards go down substantially. And part of the reason we think economic games are really powerful and important is because people are playing with real money, right? This has a real incentive for them. This is not just them sort of walking away, just having filled out a bunch of bubbles on a survey. This is real money in their pocket. And when they're giving up more or less money, that has real actual cost to them. And one important thing about um, behavioral economic studies is generally there's no deception, right? It's sort of a principle of the field. There's not a trick, right? We're not trying to frame or prime somebody or do something like that and then lie to them about it. We're going to tell you, here's the money, here's your choice, you make your decision. The dictator game is by far the most simple. Here's some money, how much do you want to share? And if we find that people share less with certain types of people, it's evidence to suggest that there is some animosity there. Real simple. Trust game is sort of similar. Basically, what happens in a trust game is I'm going to give you some money, and then I'm going to tell you, hey, John's over here. And for every dollar that you give John, I'm going to multiply it. You give John a dollar, I'm going to add another dollar to the pot. So you get the highest payout if you give all of your money to John, and then it gets doubled. But here's the catch. John can choose whether to give it back or not and how much to give it back. So you may have heard of the prisoner's dilemma. This is somewhat similar, right? We can both profit more if I give you some of my money, it gets multiplied, and then we split it. But I have a little bit at risk, right? I have to trust another person with my money. And you can probably already see where this is going. When I'm told that John votes for the other party, I'm much less likely to trust them. And that's especially costly, right? Because in a dictator game, even if I like the guy on the other side, I walk away with more if I give him nothing, right? But in a trust game, I walk away myself with more money if I first give it to John and then trust him to split it with me. Then I can actually increase my profit. But he votes for the other party. I don't like them. I don't trust them. And I kind of don't want him to walk away with a lot of money either. So people give less, right? People provide less money to their co-participant in trust games when they're told that the co-participant is a member of the other party. Okay, a couple more things that I wanted to cover before we get to class. We talked about implicit, we talked about behavioral. I think this is the last thing. So in our last section, talking about reducing affective polarization, I wanted to talk a little bit about the experiment that the researchers ran in number three, which is pretty interesting. So the researchers had people download or had the option to download a plugin, like an ad blocker on your internet browser, right? You have the browser, you can add things to it to make it do extra things. One of the things this did, that this plugin could do, was show you an opposing partisan's Twitter feed. So they would show you the tweets that a like Republican would be seeing if you were a Democrat or vice versa. Unsurprisingly, you show people a Twitter feed with somebody they disagree with. It's going to be filled with content they disagree with. They're going to get pretty angry and upset, and affective polarization is going to go up. But for some of these people, they did a really simple, not particularly invasive, and not particularly political uh, intervention, where they told them, as you're encountering this stuff, as you're reading stuff that you see that's disagreeable, think back on a time that you disagreed with a friend. And what we think is happening here is something that has been shown to increase tolerance and cooperation in psychological settings before, which is perspective taking, right? When you're thinking about disagreeing with somebody who you already, at least on some level, respect and know to be a good person, you're much more likely to consider outside arguments, maybe not as correct and maybe not even as super reasonable, but as coming from an authentic place, as genuinely held, as not malicious. And indeed, we find that can result in reductions of affective polarization, at least in some instances, where people can think of the other side and think of disagreement not in the context of thinking about the other person as an enemy, but at least as potentially a friend, and affective polarization goes down even when being exposed to things with which we disagree. And reducing affective polarization is probably, well, let me say this. It's certainly something that political scientists care a lot about, because affective polarization has all kinds of negative consequences, right? Affective polarization undermines democratic norms. So this is what I close with in our lecture notes for this week, right? It turns out that regardless of whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, If you are affectively polarized, if you view the other side as the enemy rather than as an opponent or rather than as a principled source of disagreement, both of those partisans disrespect constitutional boundaries or argue against constitutional protections when their party is in power. So things like protecting voting rights for the other side or respecting checks and balances, right, separation of powers, and so on. Both Democrats and Republicans, when they become affectively polarized, really don't want to respect any of those things if their party's in charge. And then, of course, as soon as their party is no longer in charge, wait, hold on a minute, now checks and balances matter a lot more. So, in some ways, reducing affective polarization is also promoting democracy, right? It's promoting respect for the rule of law and things like that. It's understanding that, hey, we might be in power now, we're not going to be in power later. We need to all respect the rules of the game and play fair according to the rules of the game because the rules, the democratic norms and values of checks and balances, separation of powers, protections and rights for political minority groups and things like that are going to be important because the shoe's going to be on the other foot later, right? So affective polarization is sometimes hard to fight because it is a self-reinforcing process. Because if you are very affectively polarized, even hearing things that are positive about the other side can feel like a betrayal, right? Because the other side is the enemy. If you're going to cut them any break at all, you might be the enemy. But reframing the other side as opponents rather than as enemies, as people who disagree but who are not evil, is not just a matter of like being nice to each other. And it's not just a matter of winning and losing elections. It also has inherent value in promoting democratic values. So when you begin to reduce your own affective polarization and reduce affective polarization among your network and your friends, it's not simply just like conceding something to the other side. It is also sowing seeds to protect your own rights in the future by increasing support for things like checks and balances and voting rights and so on.